Hello everyone, my name is Abd and I'll be presenting with Hannah the relationship between economic urban data and the housing market. So here's our table of contents. The problem we decided to focus on is about housing expenses and its proportion to households' income. According to an online article we found, housing expenses represent the biggest source of expenses of households' income in the US. On average, 33% of households' income is gone just on housing. Here's our research approach, which I'm not going to discuss in much detail for now, as we'll present it visually in the next slides. So the main questions we wanted to answer in our research are: which areas in the US enjoy the most economic growth and stability? What is the effect of GDP on the housing market? And what are the best metropolitan areas to live at in the US where you can make a high income while not having to pay too much on housing?
Our data had about 40 variables, so we used PCA to do dimensionality reduction. We found that about 5 clusters is sufficient to capture most of the variance in the data. We also did a 2D PCA approximation to just kind of show what this is starting to look like in 2 dimensions, but of course this doesn't fully capture the clustering in the data. Welcome to assignment 3. Let's get started. You can click on any of these MSAs in the map, and these fields on the left will populate with information about that region for the given year. You can use these arrow buttons to step 1 year at a time, forwards or backwards, or you can use the slider to jump ahead many years, and the fields will update when you let go of it. Now, let's quickly go over some of these detailed charts. So first is real per capita personal income. You can compare the real per capita personal income in both dollar value and in percent change over time. One big thing to note here is that San Francisco is very different from the other MSAs in both dollar value and the rate at which it increases over time. Next, let's go to population and housing, where again we see median home price is in San Francisco is much greater, and it increases at a rate that is much greater than the other MSAs. We also see Miami has a large amount of rent burden, or rather housing cost burden for both renters. So now let's go back to the home page, go to real GDP, and we can look at the real GDP in thousands of change 2012 dollars as well as percent change. Some things to note here is that San Francisco again has a steady increase over time, which is somewhat different than the other cities that had more variance in the not only the dollar amount per year, but the percent change per year. We can see this in Dallas and Houston, Chicago, to a lesser extent. Okay, let's go home and go to the summary page where we have clustering. So clustering kind of summarizes everything that was on the previous sheets. And well, you can see this when we looked at median housing value, and we noticed that San Francisco was greater not only in the dollar amount, but in the rate at which it changed over time. So this chart at the top is the median housing value in dollars, which it's been normalized, of course, but in clustering, you kind of see the percent change in the way that Tableau has grouped the data together. So Tableau uses the k-means clustering algorithm to make its groups, and we chose 5, which is the conclusion that we came to in the paper after we did PCA on the data. But you can see that San Francisco in 2019 and 2018 are in its own group. 2017, 2016, and 2010, it's in its own group again. And it kind of is less drastic in the other clusters. This band down here is what these are. So they never really changed over time, which makes sense. They would be in their own group. But the San Francisco, the fact that it's being grouped by itself, but it's being distinguished by years, is sort of telling in that the San Francisco of 2018 and 2019 are more like each other than the San Franciscos of preceding years. The other cities don't really do that to the extent that San Francisco does, which is kind of fascinating because it highlights how drastic its increase is over time. And the same story kind of happens in real per capita personal income, where again we see that San Francisco is greater not only in the dollar value, but when it comes to clustering, that rapid percent change kind of manifests in the way that Tableau has assigned the years 2018 and 2019 to its own cluster, and then 2015, 2016, and 2015 to another cluster, and then everything else is kind of just there. But this even the spacing between the clusters becomes like greater over time and exclusively focuses on San Francisco, which I think it's really interesting. You're welcome to look at these other things. There's not possibly enough time to get into all of the detail here, but I encourage you to do so, and I hope that you enjoy your adventure through Tableau. Some of the challenges we encountered were primarily about the way that the data was stored and getting it to be in a format that we could work with, but primarily the biggest challenge was that we did not have data that was well suited for using a prediction model that we were familiar with. We did some research into the topic, and it turns out that there is a way to do, there's a lot of ongoing research on finding patterns in like time data that has time and space components, as well as like multivariables. So if we treat like GDP as a variable and personal income, population, etc. So there is a way to do it, but the methodology for doing so is a little bit beyond what we were comfortable with, so we were unable to complete that part of the project. We were able to have some key findings though. We found that in 2015, the median home value and real per capita personal income in San Francisco accelerated in such a way that was different not only from the other MSA's rate of increase, but from its own prior rates of increase. And it was an outlier for that year following for both of those categories. The clustering that was noted in the Tableau video was another key finding. We also noticed that Houston experienced a sharp decline in real per capita personal income in 2016 that the other cities did not, as well as the fact that in Chicago, Miami, Houston, Dallas, and Philadelphia, those MSAs had the least variance in their housing prices between the years 2010 to 2019.
So this is our more general conclusion. We found that MSAs with higher populations, such as New York and Los Angeles, had higher GDPs. And this is understandable in both directions. High GDPs attract immigration and increase the population, while a higher population also means more economic productivity and GDP. We also found that most regions with higher populations had higher house values as well. This is due to the housing supply shortage that can't accommodate all of the big populations. Now, thirdly, most MSAs with bigger populations tend to have less per capita personal income. And this is due to the division of the GDP on the big population. That said, we found that the GDP correlates with the population against the per capita personal income and housing costs. And this can be all summarized in this graph to the right. As we can see, the two red graphs about the GDP and total population, they both have the same concavity, and their concavity is almost always the opposite of the concavity of these two blue graphs, which generally have the same concavity themselves. Although New York is an outlier, where we see that all the values are at a peak. So this, of course, has some policy implications. As we discussed earlier, a common question that people have is about the most economically efficient location to live. Among the 10 biggest MSAs in the US that we studied, the answer would be Houston, Dallas, and Atlanta, where the personal income is relatively high and the housing prices are generally low. With the continuously growing populations around bigger MSAs, the housing crises there continue to grow. The policies in the bigger MSAs, such as LA, should learn from those of smaller MSAs, where there must be incentives for more distribution of the population without causing an ultimate sprawl. So, midland use intensity is a good compromise. This is our reference page, and that's it. Thank you for watching.